Hey guys, in today's video I'm going to show you how to use neck bindings or neck bands or a band or binding on your wrist or your hemline in place of an actual hem. So sometimes patterns will walk you through how to do this as part of the design, but in other cases you might see a pattern like the regular t-shirt pattern that has a double fold hem and you instead want to put on a neck band or a neck binding. So I'll show you how to cut your pattern for that and how the binding works and the two different styles. A neck band will still show a seam allowance on the back side or the inside of the t-shirt, but a neck binding is a much cleaner finish. It's just a little bit trickier to get the seam exactly right on the edge of the binding itself, but it has a very clean look on the inside of your finished garment. So let's jump on over to the sewing machine and I'll show you how to sew on neck bands and neck bindings. Here we have the basic t-shirt pattern cut out. And I'm just going to show you quickly how you can substitute a regular hemline with a neck binding or a neck band. Now this pattern has a double turned 1/4 inch hemline along the neck. The pattern includes a seam allowance marking line that's marked at 1/4 inch. I've gone ahead on this piece and I've trimmed into that so that I can fold it so that you can see if we were to fold this neckline twice at 1/4 inch to create the hem, then that pattern's finished hemline is right along this pink line. So that right here is your double turned 1/4 inch hemline. Now you can see how my adjusted pattern piece would look with a seam allowance line drawn on at 1/4 inch below the new finished neckline edge. Now if you sew a binding along this seam allowance line, this will become folded down and the neck binding or neck band would fill in this 1/4 inch space. So your finished neckline would be that same neckline edge as the pattern was originally designed. So to make those adjustments on the pattern piece itself, once I've noted the design of the hemline, which is a double turned 1/4 inch, I've used my seam gauge and I've gone along, marked at 1/4, and I drew a line that's 1/4 inch past the existing seam allowance line to create that new finished cut line. And then below that, I would just take this and my pen and I would just go through and mark at 1/4 inch a new seam allowance marking line. And then you can see on this one, it's the same thing. If we fold this down to remove that extra fabric for the existing hemline, you'll see now we have a new cut line and a new seam allowance to attach the binding. To determine the length of the binding needed for this pattern, you would just measure the back neckline, but not the seam allowance at the shoulder. And then you would also measure the neckline of the front, and just remember that this is cut on a fold and this one is cut too, so you would need to double those numbers. Just don't include the seam allowance at the shoulder. Then once you have that measurement of the full neckline, I would subtract about 1/2 inch depending on how stretchy your fabric is. Because you want to have a little bit of stretch built into that binding so that it creates a nice clean edge that you can press the shape of the circle on the interior, because the interior of the neckline is smaller once it's sewn than the seam allowance line. You can also use that same technique to add binding to your sleeve hem. You would use the same technique, and you can see here we have a double fold hemline, so we would just trim this off and that would become your new cut line, and then your seam allowance line would be 1/4 inch up from that, and the binding would fill that space. In this example of the baseball tee, I'm going to show you how to attach a neck binding. So to do that, we've sewn the t-shirt up to the point of the neck seam. So we have the arms and the sleeves attached, and we have our binding cut out, and it is pressed on one side under 1/4 inch. So now we're just going to take this and we'll mark the center by folding the binding in half and you can just mark this with a pin. And then with the right side of the binding to the wrong side of the t-shirt at center front, we're just gonna pin that down. And then you can mark again by folding in the center back part of the binding to the middle just to find that next center point, and that point right there should line up with the center of the sleeve. And as we sew the binding down, it's gonna stretch slightly between these points. So we'll go ahead and pin this all the way around, and then we'll go over to the sewing machine. Now we're gonna begin sewing the binding to the t-shirt. So I find that a straight stitch works really well for this. I do have a stretch needle installed in the machine, which works really great with this type of fabric. And then the walking foot with the extra set of feed dogs helps guide the whole thing through evenly. So we're gonna position this under the foot. And once I have that where I want, I'll take out the first pin. And then we'll just carefully sew this around the entire neckline edge, being sure to stretch out only the binding as we sew. The neckline of the shirt itself, you don't want to have stretched out. So here we have that binding sewn on. Now we're just gonna go ahead and trim down this seam allowance, and then we'll press the binding up. And then once you have the binding pressed up and the seam allowance trimmed down, you'll fold this over so that it just covers the stitching line on the right side of the fabric, and then we'll top stitch this down right along that folded line. We're back at the machine, and I have this binding pinned all the way down. Now I have this under the machine, and I'm just positioning it with the needle to make sure that the needle goes down right on my fold line. And I'm just gonna go around the entire neckline edge using a straight stitch. Now here you can see the binding top stitched down around the edge, and this is a pretty visible stitch because of the contrast just for the illustration. If I was doing this for real, this would be white thread so that you wouldn't really see it along this line. And then if you look at the inside, you can see that it's a clean turned edge. So you can see the stitching line when we sewed the binding on, but there's no raw edge of the binding on the inside. Then we just do a quick press with some steam right over the neckline, and that helps bring it all back to a nice tight circle. Here we have a baseball tee sewn up to the point where the sleeves are attached, and we're ready to attach the neckband. Here we have the neckband piece. It's been pressed and folded with wrong sides together, and we have the raw edges finished with a zigzag stitch. The center of the band has been marked with a pin, and we're just going to line that up with this zigzagged edge with the raw edge of the inside of the neckline at center front. So we'll go ahead and we'll pin that right here at center front, and then mark a center point on the left side section and match that up with the center of the sleeve, and then continue to line up the center back with the center back of the t-shirt opening. Then we'll go ahead and we'll do the same thing on the other side of the t-shirt, marking the center of the binding, lining it up with the center of the sleeve right up at the top, and then continuing to line up center back with center back. Now that we have the neckband pinned onto the top of the neckline of the shirt, we're going to feed this under the walking foot And we're gonna sew this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance using a stretch needle, but a straight stitch. So the stitch is set at a 3, which is a good stitch length for this neckline. The neckline itself does not need to stretch because we have a Velcro opening at the center back of the t-shirt. So a straight stitch works really well. The stretch needle works really well for the fabric, and the feed dogs on the walking foot help guide the whole thing through from both the top and the bottom. So we're gonna slide this under and line this up, remove the pin, and then we'll sew around the entire neckline edge. Now on this stitch, I'm using this space right here in my walking foot to watch this zigzagged edge go right through here so that I'm sure that I have an evenly spaced seam allowance for my neckband, because when it's flipped up, if it's uneven and I've sewn off too far to one side or the other, it's gonna look pretty obvious. So here we have this neckband sewn on, and you can see now this piece was a 1/2 inch. So I have a 1/4 inch seam allowance and then a 1/4 inch of the binding. So I'm gonna take this over to the iron and I'm gonna press it down, and then that neckband is what's gonna show on the inside edge. Now you'll notice as I'm steaming this, I've started from center back to really kind of anchor the curve and then work my way in towards the center front neckline, which is allowing that to press nicely and then have an interior curve right here on the binding or the neckband itself. Now that we have the neckband pressed in a nice tight curve, we're just gonna run it through and top stitch along the t-shirt side of the whole neckline. So here you can see how we have that top stitch down. So that helps to hold this flat so that the neckband stays folded up. Then I'm just gonna bring this back over to the ironing board and I'm gonna press this neckline again one more time with some steam. And it'll just help have that whole neckband curve in nice and tight, especially around the arms up here, right at the shoulder and the front of the neckline. So you just have the steam, allow the steam to do the work, and then you have a nice, smooth, tight neckline on this t-shirt.